You are looking at a special edition of Gospel Roundtable. Your host, Pastor Deron Tinsley. And this Friday evening, we want to first say Happy Sabbath to those who are watching. And then we want to take a few moments tonight and deal with the subject entitled Politics, Social Reforms, and the Three Angels' Messages. Again, we are going to just address some biblical principles as it relates to politics, social reforms, the three angels' messages. How should we as a people be responding? We are in the midst of another presidential season, and a lot of things have been and are floating around as to what is going to happen, who is going to be the next president, either from a Democratic side or the Republican side. Sometime Dr. Ben Carson was running, which caused a stir among evangelicals for a time, even among Seventh-day Adventists, and all of the drama associated with Seventh-day Adventists, with the possibility of becoming the world president. All of the, I would say, the predicting prophets among us were out with their predictions, with all of their looking forward to what is going to happen with Dr. Carson running. Well, he's out of the picture, and I put a little sarcastic statement up on Facebook with, now that he's out of the picture, Ted Cruz is remaining of the hardcore evangelical, and his wife being an ex-Seventh-day Adventist. What role will that play? And I said that predictions are on the way, not for myself, but from others as they look at these different things. And so we're not going to deal with characters far as political people are concerned. We're not political pundits by any means, but we want to look at the Bible and see how should it relate. How should we relate to this political system, social reforms, Black Lives Matter, and other various entities? All of these social movements are reviving, and we're seeing something here, and we may or may not even touch on that aspect tonight, depending on where the conversation goes. And so again, tonight, politics, social reforms, and the three angels' messages.
Okay, you mentioned earlier before we prayed that it's a lot of movements going on. Of course, we're in the presidential season or whatever, and it's we have the Democrats, we have the Republicans, we have just all these movements: Black Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, all lives matter. It's a whole lot going on right now. We as Christians, we as followers of Christ, what role do we play when it comes to these things?
Well, the thing is, what we must understand is that regardless of what is happening in the world, our position as a people has not changed since the beginning of time. As a matter of fact, we'll start from the time of Abraham, because that's where we see a movement taking place in the days of Abraham. And so when we look at that from that time moving forward, we can see the position that God had wanted us to play. As a matter of fact, we can go just quickly in our Bibles. Let's go to the book of Genesis. One thing that you will note is that evangelicals are up on high alert because they feel that this is the one opportunity that pretty much remains for them to affect some change in society here in North America, and yea, even around the world. But specifically here in North America, they are really up in arms. Maybe a few years back, there was individuals who were on the evangelical side that were holding all sorts of conference meetings, actually teaching people how to get into political office, encouraging members and Christians to take part in the political arena, and they were needed in the political world. As a matter of fact, there is a video of various speeches, talks that Ted Cruz's father had given as it relates to the role that Christians should be playing in this political season. And so he has ramped up many evangelicals to get themselves involved in politics. Having said that, from the Bible, we understand what they tried to use with Paul and so forth and so on to try to show we should be involved in the political world. But one thing we want to keep in mind, let's as again we said Abraham. If you start at Genesis chapter 10, Genesis 10, you look at Genesis 10, 11, and 12. What is important to note is the genealogy starting with Noah, even at chapter 9 and verse 28. And you go into chapter 10, and then you look at chapter 11, where it begins to mention the genealogy of Noah's children. It mentions the ages of Shem's line particularly, and when he began to have children. Now, why is that so important for us to keep in mind in this context in which we're looking at? Because while Nimrod had begun the building of his kingdom, which was there in the land of Shinar, when they had rejected the covenant of God, and through the instigation and the leadership of Nimrod, they had established a one world government. That's what they were establishing with the Tower of Babel. In the midst of this coming together, this one world alliance, you move into Genesis chapter 12, and you begin to see what would be God's answer or God's answer to this one world order. Yes, the languages were confused in Genesis chapter 11, but what was to be God's answer for this movement in society? And it tells us here in Genesis chapter 3, Genesis chapter 12, Genesis chapter 12, Genesis 12, beginning at verse 1, and it says here, "Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee." Verse 2, "And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing." Watch this, verse 3, "And I will bless them that bless thee, and I will curse them that curseth thee." Now notice, "And in thee," notice, "shall all the families of the earth be blessed." And when you begin to follow out this blessing, it was connected to his seed. Paul says, Galatians 3:16, "Not many, but one, Christ." So as Abraham had gone out into the world, what was to be God's solution for the strife? It was to be Abraham. What was he to do? Let's go to chapter 18. Let's fast forward. Chapter 18. All right. And notice what God says to Abraham as it relates to Sodom and Gomorrah. Genesis 18. And let's begin in verse 17. Genesis 18. And let's look at verse 17. It says this, "And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham the thing which I do?" And the context is he was headed towards Sodom and Gomorrah. It says, "Shall I hide from Abraham the thing which I do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great nation, great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him." Verse 19, For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he have spoken of him. And so here we find Abraham was to take the laws, the justice, the principles of the principles of Christ were to be disseminated into the earth. Just as the Tower of Babel, when the language was confused, they carried that one world religion mindset into all the nations of the earth. God says, how can we now, what must I now do? God says a people must be raised up that will go into the world and disseminate the principles of truth. Now, let's quickly fast forward to the book of Colossians. Let's fast forward. Let's go to Colossians. Colossians chapter 1. All right, I want you to notice what the apostles did. All right, I want you to notice what the apostles did in one generation. Colossians, the first chapter. All right, we want to look at this. Colossians 1. Again, our subject is politics, social reforms, and the three angels' messages. Because what happens is people have the mindset that, okay, when Christians don't want to be involved in politics, they don't care what's happening in the world. And I remember, I believe it was midterm elections, when it was First Lady Michelle Obama had begun to visit a lot of the black meetings, church meetings, black organizations began to hold rallies. And one thing she, if I could use the word, kind of chided, rebuked, encouraged the black church to become more involved in politics. She was urging the black church to become more involved in politics, midterm elections. Okay, so now there is this reluctancy for churches to some extent to get involved in politics. But on the other hand, we see many pastors involved in a lot of social activities that would encourage their members to involve themselves in politics. There are even some who may not go to the ballot box, but by all means, they are involved in the political process. What should we be doing again is the question. Should we ignore the social ills of society? Should we ignore the brutality? Should we ignore the bigotry, the racism? Should we ignore these things and just pray that all these things will go away somehow? Or look, well, God has provided me another place in heaven. Therefore, I don't have to worry about the social ills that are taking place down here. That's not the position that God would have us in. And we're going to see that as we move forward. But again, we're looking at examples to gain principles on how we should be proactive in dealing with things that are happening in the world. Now watch, Colossians 1. So now remember, God told Abraham, go out into the world and you were to be a blessing to all the families of the nations, all the families of the earth. He says here, Colossians 1, notice what Paul says. If ye continue, Paul speaking, if ye continue in the faith grounded and settled, and be not moved away from the hope of the gospel, which ye have heard, and which, notice, was preached to what?
Every creature.
Every creature which is under heaven, whereof I, Paul, am made a minister. Go back with me to the book of Acts. Go back with me to the book of Acts, chapter 19. Look here very quickly. Acts 19 and 10. All right, Paul was preaching. It says, but when divers were hardened and believed not, but spake evil of that way, the way in which Paul was speaking of the gospel, before the multitude, he departed from them separated the disciples, disputing daily in the school of one Tyrannus. Verse 10. And he continued by the space of how long?
2 years.
2 years. So that how many? All they which dwelt in Asia heard the word of the Lord Jesus Christ, both Jews and Greeks. So the Bible says in the space of 2 years, Paul was able to effectively preach the gospel in Asia. But now I want us to notice, what was the effect of that preaching? What was the effect? Jump over to verse 26. Let's see the effect of Paul's preaching the gospel. Verse 26. He says, moreover, this is Demetrius now, who is opposing Paul, because he's opposing Paul because Paul's gospel goes against what Demetrius stands for. Now notice what he says in verse 26. Demetrius speaking, he says, moreover, ye see and hear that not alone in Ephesus, but almost how much? Throughout all Asia, this Paul hath persuaded, turned away much people, saying that there be no gods which are made with hands. So wait a minute. So in the space of 2 years, the influence of the gospel persuaded, they said, almost all of Asia to do what? To turn away from these false gods. Now, you say, well, what again, preacher, what does all this mean? Well, understand this. If you ever heard of a terminology is something that has been revived again among the New Age and among the music culture. It's called karma. All right, karma believes that, hey, you reap what you sow. Yeah. Now, what happens is one will say, well, you reap what you sow. But this pagan philosophy of karma is a Buddhist New Age pagan philosophy, and is this. Whatever you are reaping in this life, they believe that is karma, something that you have or are paying for from a former life. So in other words, if you are in poverty, especially when you go to India, places of the Far East, you see this. And what they believe is that, okay, if you're suffering in this life, then you are paying for something you did in a former life. However, if you endure this suffering in your next life, you are going to receive something better. So what happens is that causes individuals to see you suffering, and they must let you suffer because they don't want to interfere with your karma. So they must leave you to suffer whatever has come by your violation in a former life, because they believe in reincarnation. So what's happening is, because Paul effectively was able to persuade people to Christ, they understand that, wait a minute, that is not the gospel of Christ. The gospel of Christ, according to James chapter 2, makes one understand that, listen, as well as 1 John chapter 3, how can you love God and hate your brother who you have not seen? How can you see them suffering and just pronounce a blessing on them and walk the other way? The Bible says, the gospel says, that's not faith, that's dead works. So again, this is effectively how change was to be effected into the world. This is how change was to come to change society. So when God has called the church, let's go back in our Bible to the book of Isaiah 58. Isaiah 58. Again, the church's response to the things that we're seeing in society. We're going to Isaiah 58. All right, let's look at Isaiah chapter 58. And I want us to notice what God's solution is for what we see happening in society. And again, we're going to come a little closer and look at some pertinent things that's happening. Isaiah 58. Notice God's call. God says this, verse 6, is not this, he says, the fast that I've chosen, to loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and that ye break every yoke. Is it not to deal thy bread to who?
The hungry.
And that thou bring the poor that are cast out to thy
House.
when thou seest the naked, that thou
Cover.
and that thou hide not thyself from thine own flesh. So the Bible is, again, God has brought the church into direct relation with himself, and the work that God is calling us to do transcends political parties and social reform movements. Because what happens is, in these various movements of the day, the same spirit of superiority, the same spirit of bigotry exists. And what happens is, most times, you see many of these social movements attaching themselves to very polarized scenarios to forward their program. In other words, if I attach myself to, say, a person who is being beat down by a police officer, and I attach myself to that particular atrocity, what happens now is that I can use that to solicit more funds into my social movement. Because what happens is, God, notice, let's move forward. Go with me to Luke. Go with me in your Bibles to the book of Luke. All right, Luke chapter 10. Because what happens is, many times these social movements do not fight for everyone's best interest. They attach themselves to those movements that are again publicized and can be polarized, thus bringing in more finances, because it appears as though they themselves are fighting for that individual. Let's give a quick scenario. Gentleman in Chicago, he was shot by a police officer more than 16 times. And then we see this uproar as the videotapes were released, or the tapes were released to the public. It caused a stir. But the interesting thing about it that I noted is that by time the tapes were released and the public came in, the family of the deceased young man had already been compensated by the state. And they were, to a degree, already moving on. Not to say that they just forgot it and didn't care anything about it, but they had already received compensation. They were moving in a particular direction. And so now when the tapes are released and everyone's attached to itself, the family has already received their compensation. The family, to a great degree, whether they came to someone and whether they pushed for the tapes to be released or whether they sought for an indictment of the police officer who did that, I am not aware of. But the thing is, everyone who attached themselves to it, this had happened over a year ago, and it was something that, again, was settled to an extent. And everyone came in and they blew up the case. The mayor was called into question. But prior to that, as that was happening, a 9-year-old had been gunned down, mafioso style, and there was nothing mentioned of it in the protest. So again, it begins to cause you to say, well, what are these things really about? Now again, it's not about Black Lives Matter, because the Black Lives Matter will be today. The Rainbow Coalition was yesterday, and all these other different movements, the NAACP, all of these various movements, the Ku Klux Klan, whatever the case may be. Not clumping them all together, but making the point that God's people are to take a position on the side of right. That is where our position is to be. Because we must understand that the reforms that God is asking us to enact goes beyond the surface, goes beyond laws, go beyond passing of bills. It is the conversion of the heart. Because you cannot write up any piece of legislation that will cause a man to love another individual. It will never cause another man to respect another man's life. If he hates that individual, he will find within those laws or those parameters to come up with a more economical way to bring injustice to those particular people, i.e., the prison industrial complex. Talk about that in a moment, and at maybe in the future. But let's look at Luke chapter 10 very quickly. Luke 10, in the story of the Good Samaritan. All right, story of the Good Samaritan. And here we find that a man going down from Jericho, Luke 10, and all of a sudden, while he's half dead, the Bible says in verse 30, and Jesus answering said, and a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. So he was leaving church and he was going home, as it were, and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him, departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance, there came down a certain priest that way. And when he saw him, what did he do? Pass by on the other side. Verse 32. And likewise a Levite, when he was at that place, came, looked on him, passed by on the other side. Verse 33. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he did what?
Had compassion.
He had compassion on him. So now we look at this story and we see that the two passed by, and what did they not discern in the man? They didn't know who he was. They did not see the benefit of helping such a one, and so therefore they passed by on the other side. In other words, there was nothing to be gained politically or any otherwise from helping him, and thus they went on the other side. Whereas when the Samaritan came, the Samaritan did not judge him by his skin color. He didn't judge by the way he laid. He didn't judge him by the district he was in. He saw the man, and then the story goes on to let us know that the Samaritan came out of his own pockets to secure this man's recovery. This is the place that God would have the church to act. This is the position that God would have his people to act. Now, if you don't have a question, I'm going to read a statement.
Yes. Go ahead.
All right?
No, go ahead.
I'm going to read this statement. All right. Now, this is concerning Christ when he was here upon the earth. All right? Politics, social reforms, and the three angels' messages.
That actually was my next question.
All right.
Where did Christ stand as far as...
How did Christ relate to these particular issues? Notice what it says. It says the government, I'm reading from a book called Desire of Ages. The government under which Jesus lived was corrupt and oppressive. On every hand were crying abuses, extortion, intolerance, and grinding cruelty. Yet the Savior attempted no civil reforms. So the nation upon which Christ came under, there was, what does it say? It was corrupt and oppressive. We know how oppressive and corrupt it was. when it had all the babies 3 years old and under killed, and there was no political backlash. We recognize that Christ mentioned, I believe it is in Luke chapter 13, about how Pilate had caused some people to be killed while in the midst of their worship. We read that you had publicans who exacted more than what was required by Caesar. These were corrupt and injustices. But Jesus did not enact any social reforms. Going on, it says this: He attacked no national abuses, nor condemned the national enemies. In other words, those who were the national enemies were the Jews. Their national enemies were the Samaritans and the Romans, as also the Greeks. Anyone, any Gentile, they were national enemies. So Jesus was not a Jew and stood on the side and he hated what if today the Tea Party. Jesus would not be opposed and speaking ill to Republicans and Democrats or independents. He would not be lashing out at positions that various politicians are taking. But he would be able to, again, he's trying to get us to see things from a bird's eye view. Is it corrupt? Yes, we'll see more of this in a moment. It says, He, Christ, did not interfere with the authority or administration of those in power. He who was our example kept aloof from earthly governments, not because he was indifferent to the woes of men, but because, watch this, but because the remedy did not lie in merely human and external measures. To be efficient, the cure must reach men individually and must regenerate the heart. Desire of Ages 509. Jesus saw that a man must be born again before any change could take place. Now, when you look at Zacchaeus was a publican. Zacchaeus was among those who exacted more than their due require. In other words, Caesar said, I require this amount, and gave license to the publicans to add on their own fees. And this is what they did. They added on their own fees, and as a result of it, they were able to burden down the people. What do we see today? They raise taxes on businesses. What do you hear? Politicians saying we need to raise taxes on the higher. But again, what is this doing by them raising taxes? It is giving the businesses and the corporation the license to exact more from the people, but they cannot give that without pretending to be on the side of the poor and the less fortunate. So it is a word game. It is a word game. Just like after 2008, when there was a credit crisis, when the bubble burst, and various individuals were trying to bring legislation to put the credit cards in a bind so they could not just raise their interest rates at any given time when they wanted to. And they said, no, the interest rates must be fixed, and if there is to be a raise, the customers must be noted at a certain time in advance. The bill was put forth, and they said, wow, the credit cards companies are going to be reined in, and they're not going to be able to beat the poor down, and everyone was cheering, yes, they're going to save us. But what they did not tell you was that they gave the credit card industry months before the bill would be enacted to adjust themselves to the new policies so they would not be affected by the legislation that went in. So the credit card companies was given almost a year's time to adjust themselves financially to the bill that was being presented. And what you must realize today is that there is no bill that is put forth by Congress that is not written by lobbyists. In other words, businesses, the industry cannot take the chance that Darren Tinsley, as a politician or as a senator or a congressman, will go forth and argue correctly what this organization needs. And so what they will do is that they will write the bill, give it to me, and then I go up and argue with it.
Got it.
And I put it forth as though it is a bill I'm putting forth, but in reality it was written by the various industries. So they said for every one senator, you have maybe 5, 10 or so lobbyists that lobby to get certain things done. So this is why Christ recognized that nothing could be done by enacting social reforms. Point about Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was a publican. Zacchaeus was beating down the people, as it were, with these high costs. But Zacchaeus recognized his ill treatment not because of Barabbas and his social reform, but because of John the Baptist preaching. When he heard John the Baptist, and when you look in the book of Luke, John told publicans not to exact more than was required. Zacchaeus was of the publicans. This is why in Luke 19, when Jesus came to Zacchaeus' home, Zacchaeus says, I give to the poor, and he says, I give them fourfold. That was a principle that is found in the book of Leviticus. If you rob a person, you was to restore them fourfold. So Zacchaeus realized that he was robbing the public, and he returned to them their extra taxes that they should not have been paying. But what brought Zacchaeus to that conclusion? Not Barabbas, John the Baptist. So if we are going to change the way that policies are enacted, then the gospel is the only effectual change that can happen. Most of those politicians go to church on Sunday. Most of them go to church on Sunday. Thus, if there's no change being seen on Capitol Hill, it is because no change is being seen on the church's hills. Okay, so we find that Christ did not enact various reforms. It wasn't because he was unconscious of the abuses, but he recognized if the heart is not regenerated, nothing could take place. Now I want to fast forward. If you have something.
Okay, so up until this point, we see that you read that Christ didn't deal with the worldly things. He came with the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
John came with the gospel. He didn't attach himself to anything that was in the world politically or whatever. Okay, in our time, people have died, people have went to war, people have protested everything and brought us to this point to give us the right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
Speak on that.
All right. So now what happens is, when you look at, and one thing that most people don't understand about the movement of civil rights is that the movement of civil rights was not alone something that came about through people desire to vote alone. When you look at the history of the civil rights, you see that the South has always had an intimate relationship with the Vatican. They've always had an intimate relationship with the Vatican. When the Civil War began, General Lee was referred to by the Pope, I'm not sure of the Pope at that time, as the president. In other words, the Vatican played an intricate role in the Civil War. And it was their purpose through the uprising of the South to break up the Union, because the Vatican did not support the American Constitution, the American Bill of Rights. They thought it was an impious, a bill or a document, and they felt that it was, lack of better words, it was just ridiculous. And they supported the uprising of the South, and slavery became the perfect catalyst for a civil war. It became the perfect catalyst for a civil war. And what happens is, when you look at what was happening, you had various individuals. Slavery in this country was an economy. In other words, cotton was our greatest export over any other raw goods that we had. Cotton was our greatest export. It was our economy. Not only was it working the South, but the North as well was being benefited by slavery. All right? What happened was, slavery wanted to expand. The North did not want slavery to expand, not because they cared about slaves, but because they felt that letting slavery expand would not be good for the economy. Because if I have slaves and I'm allowed to expand, well, if you're in the North and if you're in a state that doesn't have slaves, that's not allowed to have slaves, then you cannot compete with me in the marketplace. I will dominate, and eventually your company or whatever contracts you have will lose them to me, because I can produce them for a much cheaper cost than you're able to. And so when the politicians looked at this, they said, we cannot let slavery expand because it would destroy the economy of the North. The slaves wanted to expand slavery. Again, cotton was an export. So what happens is, there was this talk of a civil war. Now, I want to, and I'm glad you brought up that, because I want to lead into this a quotation here, taken from Volume 1 of the Testimonies, page 254. Volume 1, page 254. Quickly, so we see this uprising in the South. When you look at civil rights was not a wake-up moment for various blacks and decide we need to organize so that we can we can do away with the Jim Crow and so on and so on. When you study the civil rights movement, there was a good documentary that was done on it called Many Rivers to Cross, an excellent documentary that showed that the civil rights, with the freedom riders, with the sit-ins, with the boycotts, it was all strategically designed in various classrooms and board meetings and so forth. College kids went to trainings to show them how to sit in and not retaliate. It was a strategic plan. Nothing necessarily wrong with strategically planning. That's not the point. But the reality of it is, there was something more undergirding the movement than just simple acts to vote. Now, and what people will not tell you on record or in front of a camera is that the civil rights also played a very key role in marginalizing the black race and almost making them irrelevant in society. So it had its pros and it had its cons. It literally almost made irrelevant an entire generation who, up until that time, to some degree, were gaining in their relevance. Why? Because they were, quote unquote, isolated. And while they were being isolated, they were becoming stronger financially as a people. But if you disband them as a people, then they cannot be so strong and be able to orchestrate and move policy and the country in a particular direction. So the civil rights, while on the surface it gave us some freedoms, but in the long run it has marginalized an entire race of people to where today we are more as a people irrelevant in society than we were during the time of Jim Crow. That's a hard statement, but the reality of it is, because you have black ball players and football players, and because you have a couple of people in political office that make no decision, that have no clout, and when they start to get out of line, they will turn their mic off while they're speaking. We have become almost irrelevant as a people, but civil rights was supposed to give us this. And what we're seeing is a lot of these social reforms, again, that are brewing, it is further marginalizing the black race. Now watch this. This is a very important point. Civil slavery and the Civil War. Watch this statement, Volume 1, page 254. Thousands have lost their lives, she says. Many have returned to their homes, maimed, crippled. This is after the Civil War. Crippled for life. Their health gone, their earthly possession prospects forever blighted, and yet how little has been gained. Thousands have been induced to enlist with the understanding that this war, the Civil War, was to exterminate slavery. This is what we've been told. Yeah. That Civil War was to do away with slavery. She says this, thousands have been induced to enlist with the understanding that this war was to exterminate slavery. But now that they are fixed, they find that they have been deceived, that the object of this war is not to abolish slavery, but to preserve it as it is. So the Civil War had nothing to do with freeing slaves. If you go and look at Abraham's documents that he wrote during the time of the Civil War, he had no intentions on freeing the slaves. He was of the mindset that blacks should be taken back to Africa, because he felt that maybe they would be better off in another society. This was his mindset. So it was almost a year or 2 years into the Civil War that slavery, that's again, freeing the slaves was a means to cripple the South's economy. This is why after the Civil War ended, you had what is called the Reconstruction period, where slaves, and gave birth or rise to the modern day prison industrial complex, where prisons and their occupants are on the stock market. So you go from the prison system to the judicial system to the policing system. It is all one step to making sure that the industrial prison complex remains vibrant and full, so that the stock of the prison and the prisoners can be traded like stock and cattle.
You've been listening to gospel media recorded by Everlasting Gospel Bible School with Pastor Deron Tinsley. To contact, support, or obtain similar media from Everlasting Gospel Bible School, contact us at P.O. Box 204-209, Augusta, Georgia 30917, or call us at 706-421-7719. And lastly, on the web, visit us at egbibleschool.org. Again, that's egbibleschool.org. May God richly bless you.